Hi, everyone. Tanya Hertz here. I wanted to share with you the slides on from the leadership class and working in teams, working with groups, teams, their leadership, the difference between groups and teams. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll go ahead and get started. So, all right, perfect. Leadership and groups. Teams and leadership are intrinsically linked. You cannot lead if you do not have people to lead. And groups are different than teams. Groups and teams are different in many ways. It's more than just the skills, abilities, values, motivations of the people who are in them. It's their ultimate purpose, right? Groups can be something that you form with just friends, and often we get these terms confused, or we're not using the right term when we're talking about here. Actually, I'm going to stop here. Hi everyone, Tanya Hertz here, and we're talking today about teams, groups, their difference, and leadership and teams. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see the PowerPoints that I see. And we'll just start right in groups and teams and the difference between the two. So groups are different than teams in that groups have their own special characteristics. We use the terms interchangeably, but they mean very different things. So groups look, from the group perspective, it looks at how different characteristics can affect the relationship, the interpersonal communication amongst the followers, the leaders, and the situation. Teams are different than groups, and they have a much stronger sense of identification, self-identification, than groups. You can go out with a group of friends to dinner. At the end, you're still friends, but the group is dissolved. It's not, we don't so closely tie our identities to that group necessarily. Now, teams are different than groups in that they have that common shared purpose. There's a common goal. There's a common set of outcomes. There's a common set of tasks. And there is a high degree of interdependence or interrelation in teams, typically significantly more than with groups. Teams often have specialized roles within the groups, and if you want to look at just a clear way of looking at it, is teams are like a form of very specialized groups. So when we say group, a group is it's two or more people working together, and they influence one another. So each person influences and influences by the other people. And it's important that this definition is important because it introduces the concept of reciprocal influence between the leaders and the followers. And groups and teams both share that reciprocal influence. Group members, they influence, they interact, they do things together. And it's also important to point out that just because you're part of one group does not preclude you from being in another group. And most of us are in many groups and teams simultaneously. And it's funny, groups are a huge part of what we do, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. We do when we're in organizational leadership type classes, when we're in looking at management of human beings. And so we're going to dive in deep. And we're going to start by talking about size. Size matters when it comes to teams and groups. Now, how likely it is that a leader will emerge is largely dependent upon the size of the group. Now, ideal sizes of groups and teams will differ depending on what the purpose of the group is, but we know that typically as groups become larger, you're more likely to see cliques, you're more likely to see leaders lose their span of control, you're likely to see in-groups and out-groups, and just whole different dynamics. We know in general, in the aggregate, the ideal size for efficacy or effectiveness is 5 to 6 members. I'm sorry, I take that back, 5 to 7 members, 5 to 7 members. Now, again, this will vary based on the purpose, but for most work teams, for most school teams, 5 to 7 members is ideal. And you can see how things will break down as you start to add people or take people away from there. So it depends largely on whether or not the tasks are additive or if the process is more of combination effort. So an additive task is when the group's output, it's simply all of the individual outputs put together. Now, the example I love to give with this is the Girl Scouts, because we all know those adorable little Girl Scouts who sell their cookies. It doesn't matter how big a troop is. A troop can be huge because they're not, because there's more disjointive type tasks. There's additive type tasks where they just take the outcomes of everybody, add them all up, and you've got, you know, the troops' sales at the end. It doesn't matter. They're not as reliant upon one another. And so with that, you typically see bigger groups are better. Process losses are when there are inefficiencies that are inherent in teams and groups just by having more people. So I think all of us have seen this. When you have more people working together, you lose a lot of efficacy. This happens. It's difficult when you're growing a company. As you're starting to get past that point of hiring people, sometimes you can do a lot more with a team of 3 than you can with a team of 30. And a lot of it has to do with social loafing. When you have social loafers on a team, those are the people who they don't help, they loaf. They know that their shared output will be dependent on the team's performance, not necessarily their individual. And so they just sit back and let the team do amazing things while they are not contributing. Now, social facilitation is the reason why groups typically do better than individuals, and group performance can be better than individual performance. And that's because many people will typically work harder in the presence of other people rather than on their own. And that's so important to note while we're working in this virtual environment. When you're working with employees, sure, you can do some of your work asynchronously, but it's so important to get together and also work at the same time with them. Okay, so these are the standard stages of team development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Not all teams go through the same stages in the same order, but all teams do typically go through most of those. Oops, sorry, let me go back one. In the forming stage, this is typically when there's just a politeness, everybody's getting to know one another, everybody's happy, and it's not until we start to get comfortable with the group and start to try to define our roles that the storming occurs in the group. And again, this very normal, you see this in almost every group. Then the group will typically go through a period of normalization, and the storming kind of settles down, and all of the conflict settles down, and people start to normalize. Then they perform. There's adjourning is a separate stage, and it's actually included as a separate stage, because if the team has been together long enough and they're dependent enough upon each other, this can be kind of a uncomfortable thing breaking up. So it's important to actually manage it. Now, another model of team development is punctuated equilibrium model. And this states that people will develop patterns of behavior, and they continue along the road with it operating in inertia, just things happening, right? And then somewhere, well, let me kind of explain a little more. So this is the beginning at the bottom here, the timeline. You typically start figuring out everybody's roles, and you just move along in inertia, right? Somewhere around the middle of the project, people freak out and realize that if they do not revise their process, they will fail. And so there is that punctuated equilibrium somewhere in the middle of the project. They revise the process, and then they move forward until they can finally end the process and perform. Teams that are successful have a punctuated equilibrium. Often teams that do not have some sort of a realization that they need to change things do not perform well. So let's talk a little bit. Actually, we're going to stop here. We'll do another video for those for the next section. Oops, and my video's off. We'll see you in the next video for team member roles.